Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where insomnia meets empire and the quiet ones always keep the crown. You didn't just secure the throne, you executed a child to make sure no one else could touch it. If these midnight stories have helped you drift off, or at least made your waking hours less boring, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your own strange sleep schedule in the comments. Let us know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you exactly. Tonight, you outlive every rival, marry your enemy's daughter, and turn England into a prison of your own making, all while pretending it's for the good of the realm. Close your eyes. You're lying in bed now, safe, warm, and far away from the noise of court. The fire crackles quietly, the sheets settle against your skin, and your breath has slowed. Not with peace, but with certainty. Because the moment you opened your eyes that morning on Bosworth Field, you knew you couldn't let yourself sleep again. Now, there is only the silence of ledges turning, the flicker of candlelight on parchment, and the scratch of your pen calculating your cousin's ransom. You move like smoke through velvet halls, past locked doors and gold-painted ceilings. Sandalwood and wax cling to your fingers as you seal another debt. The prince in the tower is gone. The boy in the kitchen is scrubbing pots. And the last one, the charming one, is smiling as you walk him to the scaffold. Sleep now. No one will take the throne from you, not while you're still counting bodies. It was August 23, 1485, and Henry Tudor woke up as King Henry VII with the unsettling realization that yesterday's battlefield crown might not fit as well in the cold light of morning. The circlet Richard III had worn into battle now sat on Henry's head, still slightly dented from its previous owner's final moments. His claim to the throne required the kind of genealogical creativity that would make later historians weep. Through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, he was the great-great-great-grandson of Edward III via John of Gaunt's legitimised bastard line, which had been specifically excluded from the succession by Henry IV. It was like claiming ownership of a house because your great-aunt's illegitimate cousin once walked past it. But he had something better than legitimacy. Richard III was dead in Leicester mud, and Henry wasn't, which in medieval succession law counted for quite a lot. The immediate problem was transforming battlefield victory into actual authority. Henry's army was already dissolving, mercenaries calculating their pay, Welsh supporters heading home with stories, English nobles wondering if they'd backed the right horse. The new king's first act was to backdate his reign to August 21st, the day before Bosworth, which meant everyone who'd fought against him was technically guilty of treason. It was retroactive legitimacy with a side of potential execution, the kind of legal fiction that made nobles very nervous. He then issued a general pardon to most Yorkists, except for those who were too dangerous, too rich, or too dead to forgive. London received its new king with the enthusiasm of a city that had seen too many new kings lately. The citizens cheered because not cheering seemed inadvisable, hung out banners because banners were expected, and generally acted like this coronation would definitely be more permanent than the last several. Henry entered the city not as a conquering hero, but as a calculating accountant who'd won the ultimate hostile takeover. He smiled, waved, and mentally catalogued every noble's expression for future reference. The marriage to Elizabeth of York was the urgent priority. She was Edward IV's eldest daughter, her brothers were conveniently vanished, and marrying her would unite the warring roses through the traditional method of political bedroom diplomacy. The fact that Parliament had declared her illegitimate under Richard III was easily fixed. Parliament could undeclare things as readily as it declared them. But Henry was careful to establish his own claim first, to be crowned in his own right, to make it clear he was king because he'd won, not because he was marrying York legitimacy. Elizabeth would be queen consort, not queen regnant, and the difference mattered to everyone keeping score. The coronation, on October 30, 1485, was a masterpiece of calculated splendour. Westminster Abbey was draped in Tudor green and white alongside Lancastrian red, with just enough Yorkist white to suggest unity without admitting dependence. Henry processed through London, displaying himself to the people who needed to see their new king was real, alive, and planning to stay that way. Cardinal Bourgier, who'd crowned Edward IV, Edward V, almost, and Richard III, now added Henry VII to his collection, with the wary efficiency of a man who'd done this too many times. The holy oil was applied, the crown was placed, and England had its fourth king in 2 years. Parliament met in November to legitimise what conquest had created. They confirmed Henry's title with the enthusiasm of people who understood which way the wind was blowing. They reversed the attainders against Lancastrians, re-attainted Yorkists who'd been unattainted, and generally played legal musical chairs with noble status. Most importantly, they confirmed the royal marriage to Elizabeth, scheduled for January, which would create the Tudor dynasty and hopefully end the Wars of the Roses through reproductive merger. But already the cracks were showing. John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, Richard III's designated heir, had fought at Bosworth, but been pardoned. He attended court, smiled at appropriate moments, and was definitely not planning anything treasonous in Ireland. Margaret of Burgundy, Richard III's sister, sent congratulations that read like threats, wrapped in diplomatic language. The Earl of Warwick, son of the executed Duke of Clarence, sat in the Tower, not imprisoned exactly, just kept very safe and very controlled. Every Yorkist with a claim was a potential focus for rebellion, and Henry knew it. The royal household was organised with paranoid efficiency. Henry created the Yeoman of the Guard, a personal bodyguard loyal only to him. He instituted security procedures that made access to the royal person nearly impossible without multiple permissions. He slept in different rooms, varied his routines, and generally acted like a man who understood that kings could die in many interesting ways. It wasn't cowardice, it was the practical recognition that his claim was weak enough that staying alive was a full-time occupation. The marriage to Elizabeth of York took place on January 18, 1486 in Westminster Abbey. It was politically essential and personally awkward, uniting a man who'd spent 14 years in exile with a woman whose uncle he'd killed to take her father's throne. Elizabeth was beautiful, dignified, and had the good sense to never mention that her brothers were still mysteriously missing. Henry was thin, calculating, and had the good sense to never mention that he'd won his crown by killing her uncle. They stood at the altar, representing the union of Lancaster and York, 2 roses grafted together by necessity rather than affection. The wedding night was a matter of state importance. Producing an heir quickly would secure the succession and prove divine approval of the union. The nobility waited for news of conception, with the kind of interest usually reserved for harvest predictions. Within months, Elizabeth was pregnant, and by September 1486, Prince Arthur was born at Winchester, named for the legendary king, and born in his legendary capital, because symbolism mattered when your legitimacy was questionable. But even as Henry celebrated his heir, threats multiplied. Francis Lovell, Richard III's friend, disappeared after Bosworth, only to reappear in Yorkshire, stirring rebellion. The Stafford brothers emerged from sanctuary claiming the new king was illegitimate. Irish lords, who'd never met a rebellion they didn't like, were making interested noises about alternative claimants. Every pardoned Yorkist was a potential traitor, every unpardoned one was a certain enemy, and Henry had to calculate which was worse. The new king's response was characteristically careful. He didn't launch massive repressions that would create martyrs. Instead, he used bonds and recognizances, financial instruments that made rebellion expensive. Nobles had to post surety for their good behavior, creating a web of financial obligation that made treason economically ruinous. It was governance by mortgage, turning the aristocracy into debtors who couldn't afford to rebel. The genius was that it looked like mercy while functioning as control. Henry's council was small, efficient, and absolutely loyal. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, wielded influence without official position. John Morton, Bishop of Ely, provided ecclesiastical support and financial creativity. Reginald Bray managed the royal household with the efficiency of a man who understood that kings survived on details. Unlike previous kings who'd relied on great nobles, Henry relied on administrators who owed everything to him and nothing to heredity. The first Christmas of the new reign was celebrated with careful magnificence. Henry understood that appearing royal was almost as important as being royal. The court glittered with calculated splendour, expensive enough to impress but not so expensive as to suggest profligacy. Every ceremony was designed to establish precedent, create tradition, and make Tudor rule seem inevitable rather than accidental. The Wars of the Roses were over, everyone agreed, while carefully not mentioning that everyone had agreed that before. As 1487 dawned, Henry VII had survived longer than many expected. He had a crown, a wife, an heir, and a functioning government. He also had enemies in Ireland, pretenders in Burgundy, and nobles in England who smiled while calculating odds. The throne was his, but holding it would require constant vigilance, careful accounting, and the kind of paranoia that kept kings alive. The Wars of the Roses might be over, but the peace that followed would be harder to win than any battle. In 1487, Ireland decided to crown a 10-year-old boy named Lambert Simnel as King Edward VI, because apparently Ireland hadn't been paying attention to how well choosing alternative kings had worked out for everyone else. The boy was handsome, well-coached, and supposedly the Earl of Warwick, son of the Duke of Clarence, who drowned in wine. The fact that the real Earl of Warwick was very much alive in the Tower of London was dismissed as English propaganda. After all, would Henry VII lie about keeping Yorkist princes imprisoned? The irony was thick enough to spread on bread. Behind this unlikely pretender stood more substantial figures. John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who'd kept his head down after Bosworth, suddenly discovered urgent business in Burgundy. Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, and Richard III's sister, welcomed him with open arms and opener purse. She'd been funding Yorkist causes since her brother's death, with the dedication of someone who had nothing better to do with her money than make Henry Tudor's life difficult. Together they gathered mercenaries, made plans, and prepared to invade England on behalf of a child who may or may not have known his real name. The conspiracy had been brewing in Ireland under the guidance of the Earl of Kildare, who treated English authority the way most people treated suggestions from distant relatives, politely ignored unless convenient. A priest named Richard Simons had trained the boy, teaching him royal manners and Yorkist mythology. By May 1487, they were ready for the grand performance. Lambert Simnel was crowned in Christ Church Cathedral, Dublin, with a circlet borrowed from a statue of the Virgin Mary, because even fake kings needed real crowns. The Irish lords knelt before their new sovereign with the solemnity of people participating in either sacred ritual or elaborate theatre. Henry VII's response to news of the Irish coronation was methodical rather than panicked. He understood that Ireland choosing its own king was traditional but inconvenient. First, he paraded the real Earl of Warwick through London, allowing citizens to see the pale, confused boy who'd spent most of his life in careful custody. Then he gathered forces, secured loyalty through a mixture of threats and promises, and prepared to meet whatever emerged from Ireland. He also began keeping even more careful records of who owed him what, understanding that rebellions were often sponsored by people with outstanding debts. The invasion came in June 1487, with Lincoln landing in Lancashire with 2,000 German mercenaries and assorted Irish kerne, who fought with the enthusiasm of people who didn't particularly care which English king they were overthrowing. They marched inland, gathering support that was thinner than hoped. The English nobility, exhausted by 30 years of choosing sides, mostly chose to stay home. Some sent token forces to Henry, some sent excuses to Lincoln, most sent prayers to God that this would be over quickly. The Pretender's army grew, but not enough, moved fast, but not fast enough. The two forces met at Stoke Field on June 16, 1487, in what would be the last battle of the Wars of the Roses, though nobody knew it at the time. Henry's army was larger, better equipped, and led by the Earl of Oxford, who'd been fighting battles since before some of the combatants were born. Lincoln's force had enthusiasm, desperation, and German mercenaries who fought with professional efficiency until they realized they weren't being paid enough to die for a 10-year-old pretender. The battle was fierce but brief, lasting perhaps 3 hours before becoming a rout. The slaughter at Stoke was comprehensive in the way that final battles often are. Lincoln died fighting, taking with him Richard III's last hope for posthumous revenge. The German mercenaries died because nobody ransoms foreign professionals. The Irish kerne died because they were Irish and in the wrong place. Martin Schwartz, the mercenary captain, died professionally, probably calculating his unpaid wages to the last breath. By noon, the field was Tudor property and the Yorkist cause was fertilising Nottinghamshire. Lambert Simnel, the boy king of Ireland, was captured rather than killed, which was either mercy or calculated cruelty. Henry VII, in a decision that showed either confidence or dark humour, made the former king a turnspit in the royal kitchens. It was a living metaphor, the pretender who'd been raised high now turning meat over fires, serving the king he'd tried to replace. Later, Simnel would be promoted to falconer, suggesting either good behaviour or Henry's appreciation for ironic career progression. The boy who'd worn a crown would spend his life serving those who wore it legitimately. The aftermath of Stokefield was managed with typical Tudor efficiency. The dead were buried, the living were fined, and everyone pretended this was definitely the last battle of the dynastic wars. The Irish lords who'd crowned Simnel were pardoned because punishing Ireland was like punishing the weather, temporarily satisfying but ultimately futile. Margaret of Burgundy continued funding pretenders from her palace in Mechlin, but her resources were finite and her candidates increasingly implausible. Henry's treatment of the conspiracy's survivors was calculatedly lenient. Mass executions would create martyrs and, more importantly, deprive him of wealthy nobles to fine. Instead, he used attainder selectively, bombs extensively, and pardons expensively. The message was clear. Rebellion was forgivable but costly, and Henry VII preferred payment to punishment. It was a new kind of kingship, where the royal account book mattered more than the royal sword. The psychological impact of Stokefield was more significant than its military outcome. It proved Henry could defend his throne, that exhaustion with civil war outweighed dynastic loyalty, and that 10-year-old pretenders made poor rallying points. The nobility began to accept that Tudor rule might be permanent, or at least more permanent than the alternatives. Foreign powers noted that invasions of England were expensive and unsuccessful. The Wars of the Roses were ending not with a bang but with a whimper and an accounting ledger. But even in victory, Henry's paranoia deepened. If Ireland could crown a kitchen boy and convince German mercenaries to die for him, what else was possible? The king began developing the intelligence network that would characterize his reign. Spies were placed in noble households, ports were watched, correspondence was intercepted. Every pardoned rebel was a potential future conspirator, every foreign court was a possible sponsor of pretenders. Trust became a luxury Henry couldn't afford. The Tower of London gained new residents as Henry collected potential claimants like some men collected art. The Earl of Warwick remained in comfortable captivity, too dangerous to release, too innocent to execute. Other Yorkist heirs found themselves invited to court and discouraged from leaving. It was protective custody that protected the king, more than the prisoners. The Tower became a storage facility for inconvenient bloodlines. As 1487 ended, the kingdom was at peace, but it was a watchful peace. Henry VII had won his first major test, but he understood there would be others. Simnel was turning spits in the kitchen, but somewhere another pretender was learning his lines. Lincoln was dead, but other Yorkist heirs lived. Margaret of Burgundy was temporarily out of candidates, but she was patient and wealthy. The Wars of the Roses were over, but their echoes would reverberate through Henry's reign. The king's response was characteristic. He counted his money, updated his bonds, and kept watching. Every noble who'd supported Simnel now owed him financially as well as politically. Every potential rebel was one audit away from bankruptcy. The crown that had been won with swords would be kept with spreadsheets. It wasn't glorious, but it was effective, and Henry VII had learned that effective lasted longer than glorious. In 1491, a young man appeared in Cork claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who'd vanished in the Tower, and he was disturbingly good at it. Unlike Lambert Simnel, who'd been a child coached into royalty, Perkin Warbeck, as history would know him, was polished, articulate, and possessed an uncanny knowledge of the Yorkist court. He spoke of his miraculous escape from the Tower, his years in hiding, his divine mission to reclaim his throne. He had the bearing of a prince, the manner of nobility, and, most dangerously, the face of a Plantagenet. Ireland, which had a tradition of believing attractive liars, immediately offered support. The mystery of Warbeck's true identity would never be fully solved. He claimed to be Prince Richard, others said he was the son of a Tournay boatman, some whispered he might actually be a Plantagenet bastard coached for the role. What mattered wasn't truth but performance, and Warbeck performed magnificently. He could describe the English court in detail, knew the right names, the right stories, the right gestures. When challenged on specifics, he had ready answers about trauma, youth, and the fog of memory that satisfied those who wanted to believe. Margaret of Burgundy, that inexhaustible fountain of anti-Tudor sentiment, received Warbeck like a long-lost nephew returned from the dead. She wept. She embraced him. She proclaimed to all Europe that here was the true King of England. The fact that she'd never actually met Prince Richard was irrelevant. She recognised him with the certainty of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Her court at Mechlin became Warbeck's university, where he learnt to be more royal than royalty itself. The courts of Europe received this new pretender with varying degrees of enthusiasm and calculation. Charles VIII of France, always happy to destabilise England, acknowledged Warbeck as King Richard IV. James II of Scotland, young and ambitious, saw an opportunity to pressure his southern neighbour. Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, recognised a fellow Habsburg client when he saw one. Even Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain hedged their bets, maintaining relations with Henry while keeping channels open to his rival. It was medieval diplomacy at its finest, everyone backing everyone until someone definitely won. Henry VII's response to this new threat was more complex than his handling of Simnel. This wasn't a kitchen boy who could be turned into a kitchen boy, but a sophisticated operator, with international backing. The king's spy network went into overdrive, tracking Warbeck's movements, intercepting correspondence, bribing courtiers. Sir Robert Clifford was sent to Burgundy as a double agent, pretending to join Warbeck while reporting back to Henry. It was espionage with medieval characteristics, slow, expensive, and often unreliable. The first invasion attempt came in 1495, with Warbeck landing at Deal in Kent with a small force. It was a disaster that revealed both his weakness and his resilience. The Kentish men, who'd been expected to rise in support, instead killed 150 of his followers before he could even land. Warbeck, showing the discretion that would keep him alive longer than most pretenders, sailed away rather than pressing a lost cause. But failure in Kent didn't mean failure everywhere, and he had other options to explore. Ireland proved disappointing on his second visit. The Irish lords had learned from Simnel that backing pretenders was expensive and unsuccessful. But Scotland offered better prospects. James IV, eager to prove himself against England, welcomed Warbeck with royal honours. He provided troops, money, and most significantly, a bride, Lady Catherine Gordon, a distant royal cousin. The marriage elevated Warbeck from pretender to prince consort, at least in Scottish eyes. The Scottish invasion of September 1496 was more raid than conquest. James and Warbeck crossed the border with fanfare and proclamations, expecting northern England to rise for its true king. Instead, they found the English irritatingly loyal to Henry VII, or at least irritatingly unwilling to risk their necks for another claimant. After burning a few villages and discovering that invasion was harder than it looked, they retreated to Scotland. James began to find his expensive guest less entertaining, especially when Henry offered peace and marriage to his daughter Margaret. Warbeck's final throw came in 1497, landing in Cornwall just after the Cornish rebellion against Henry's taxes had been crushed. It was spectacularly bad timing, arriving just as potential supporters had been thoroughly defeated. He proclaimed himself King Richard IV at Bodmin, gathered a few thousand desperate men, and marched on Exeter. The city closed its gates, Henry's armies approached, and Warbeck's support evaporated like morning mist. The pretender who'd haunted Europe for 6 years was reduced to fleeing across Dartmoor like a common fugitive. The capture came at Beaulieu Abbey, where Warbeck sought sanctuary. Henry VII, showing either mercy or cruelty, offered him life in exchange for confession. Warbeck admitted to being Perkin, son of John Warbeck of Tournai, though whether this confession was true or coerced remains unknowable. He was brought to London, paraded but not executed, kept at court like an exotic pet. It was psychological warfare. Here was the fearsome pretender, reduced to a curiosity in velvet chains. But Warbeck couldn't resist one last attempt at escape in 1498. He fled Westminster, was recaptured, and found himself in the Tower with the real Earl of Warwick. 2 pretenders, one fake, one genuine, sharing captivity in history's most ironic cellmate situation. The government claimed they plotted together, which was convenient since Henry needed to eliminate both. In November 1499, Warbeck was hanged at Tyburn, while Warwick was beheaded on Tower Hill. Different executions for different classes, but equally dead. The international reaction was muted relief. Ferdinand and Isabella, who'd made their daughter Catherine of Aragon's marriage to Prince Arthur conditional on there being no Yorkist claimants, were satisfied. James VI of Scotland proceeded with his own marriage negotiations. Margaret of Burgundy finally ran out of both pretenders and credibility. The courts of Europe accepted that Henry VII was, boringly but definitely, going to remain King of England. The cost of defeating Warbeck had been enormous, not just in money, though Henry carefully tracked every penny, but in the constant vigilance required. For 8 years the king had lived with the knowledge that somewhere a plausible alternative existed. Every noble who received Warbeck kindly was noted. Every merchant who traded in his territories was watched. Every priest who prayed for the true king was reported. The machinery of surveillance that would characterize Tudor rule was built in response to Perkin Warbeck. The psychological impact on Henry was permanent. If a boatman's son could convince half of Europe he was a prince, what else was possible? If Margaret of Burgundy could fund pretenders from her widow's portion, what other threats lurked in foreign courts? If nobles would risk everything for dubious claimants, how secure was any loyalty? The king who'd been cautious became paranoid. The administrator who'd been careful became obsessive. As the new century approached, England had peace, but it was a supervised peace. Warbeck was dead, Warwick was dead, the obvious pretenders were eliminated. But Henry knew that pretenders were like weeds. Cut one down and another might sprout. His response was to make rebellion not just dangerous, but unprofitable. Every noble was financially bound to the crown. Every merchant was dependent on royal favour. Every potential conspirator knew that others were probably spies. The legacy of Perkin Warbeck was a kingdom where everyone watched everyone. Henry VII had learned that threats could come from anywhere, from Tournai boatmen or Irish priests, from Scottish kings or Burgundian duchesses. His survival depended not on trusting but on suspecting, not on generosity but on calculation. The crown won at Bosworth had been defended against kitchen boys and boatmen's sons. Now it was time to make it profitable as well as permanent. With the pretenders dead and buried, Henry VII revealed his true genius lay not in winning battles, but in winning audits. The king, who'd spent 14 years in exile watching others spend money, had developed strong opinions about fiscal responsibility, most of which involved other people giving him theirs. John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, provided the theological framework for this royal avarice with his famous fork. If a noble lived lavishly, he could afford high taxes. If he lived modestly, he must be saving money and could afford high taxes. It was logic so beautiful in its inescapability that it made grown lords weep into their account books. The system of bonds and recognizances that Henry developed was medieval financial engineering at its most sophisticated. Instead of simply fining nobles for real or imagined offences, he required them to enter into bonds, legal agreements, to pay enormous sums if they misbehaved. A lord might owe £1,000 sterling, 0 pence, for his good behaviour, with his friends pledging similar amounts as guarantors. One wrong move and entire social networks faced bankruptcy. It was collective punishment through compound interest, turning the nobility into a debtor's prison where everyone watched everyone else to protect their investments. The Court of Star Chamber, meeting in the starred ceiling chamber at Westminster, became Henry's enforcement mechanism. Unlike common law courts with their juries and procedures, Star Chamber operated on royal prerogative. No jury meant no bribes, no procedures meant no delays, no appeal meant no escape. Lords who thought their ancient privileges protected them discovered that accounting irregularities were remarkably easy to find when the king's commissioners looked hard enough. Every estate had some questionable title, every inheritance some procedural flaw, every nobleman some technical violation that could become expensive. Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, Henry's financial enforcers, became the most hated men in England by doing exactly what their master wanted. They pursued debts with the enthusiasm of men who got percentages, which they did. They found violations of laws nobody remembered existed, imposed fines for crimes nobody remembered committing, and generally made themselves rich, making the king richer. Their methods were legal in the sense that the king said they were legal, which, in absolute monarchy, was the only sense that mattered. The genius of Henry's system was that it looked like law while functioning like extortion. Everything was documented, filed, sealed with appropriate authority. Nobles weren't robbed. They entered into voluntary agreements after being shown the alternative. They weren't imprisoned. They were financially bound to good behavior. They weren't persecuted. They were held to the same high standards as everyone else, assuming everyone else owed the king enormous sums. It was tyranny through paperwork, oppression by audit. The council learned in law, established around 1500, specialized in finding new ways to interpret old laws profitably. Feudal obligations that hadn't been enforced for centuries suddenly became active debts. Wardships were sold to the highest bidder, marriages were taxed at maximum value, and every medieval right became a modern revenue stream. The council learned that law was remarkably flexible when interpreted by lawyers who answered only to the king. Foreign observers marvelled at Henry's transformation of England from battlefield to counting house. The Venetian ambassador reported that the king knew every noble's income better than they did. The Spanish ambassador noted that Henry personally checked every account, annotating margins with his spidery handwriting. The French ambassador wondered if this was still monarchy or some new form of merchant republic where the king was chief accountant. All agreed that England was becoming rich, though nobody seemed particularly happy about it. The noble families of England adapted to this new reality with varying success. Some, like the Earl of Oxford, proved loyalty through decades of service and were rewarded with trust and slightly lower bonds. Others, like the Earl of Suffolk, found themselves paying for their Yorkist blood through instalments that would last generations. The game was no longer about military might but financial survival, not about commanding armies but avoiding audits. It was a revolution in governance that replaced swords with spreadsheets. Henry's personal involvement in financial matters bordered on obsession. He supposedly kept private books recording every penny owed by every subject, updating them personally in his chambers. He would summon nobles to explain discrepancies in their accounts, conducting interrogations that were part audit, part confession. He knew who had borrowed from whom, who had mortgaged which estates, who could afford what payments. It was intelligence gathering through accounting, surveillance through spreadsheets. The impact on court culture was profound. Instead of competing in martial display, nobles competed in careful mediocrity. Too much wealth invited investigation, too little suggested hidden assets. The sweet spot was comfortable poverty, visibly struggling to meet royal demands while secretly maintaining reserves. Fashion became less elaborate, entertainment less lavish, the entire aristocratic lifestyle compressed by the fear of seeming too prosperous. The church wasn't exempt from Henry's financial attention. Bishoprics were kept vacant so the king could collect their revenues. Monasteries were audited for proper payment of feudal dues. Even sanctuary rights could be negotiated for the right price. Cardinal Morton set the example, contributing generously to royal coffers while ensuring other clergy did likewise. God and Mammon reached an understanding, mediated by compound interest. By 1505, Henry VII had transformed England into Europe's most solvent monarchy. The treasury that had been empty at his accession now bulged with over £1 million. The nobility that had spent centuries fighting was now too indebted to rebel. The kingdom that had torn itself apart for 30 years was held together by financial obligations stronger than any oath. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't chivalrous, but it was extraordinarily effective. The human cost was measured in stress rather than blood. The nobles lived in constant fear of financial ruin. Merchants operated under ever-changing regulations designed to maximize royal revenue. Common people paid taxes on everything that moved, and several things that didn't. But they weren't dying in civil wars, which, by 15th century standards, was progress. Henry had discovered that financial oppression was more sustainable than military oppression. The system's weakness was its dependence on the king's personal involvement. Henry's obsessive attention to detail, his encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's finances, his network of personal obligations, all required a king who preferred accounting to hunting. His son, waiting in the wings, showed signs of preferring almost anything to accounting. The financial architecture that Henry built would require Henry to maintain, and Henry was mortal. As the years passed, Even Henry seemed to recognize the unsustainability of his system. The bonds grew larger, the fines more creative, the extractions more desperate. It was as if he was trying to squeeze enough money from England to last forever, to build a treasury that could survive any successor's profligacy. He couldn't conquer death, but he could audit it, fine it, and enter it into a recognizance for its good behavior. The legacy of Morton's fork and Henry's financial instruments was a new kind of monarchy. Kings had always taxed, but Henry made taxation into governance itself. He proved that control through debt was more effective than control through force, that fear of bankruptcy motivated better than fear of execution. He transformed England from a medieval kingdom into an early modern state through the simple expedient of making everyone owe him money they couldn't afford to pay. Henry VII's foreign policy was constructed like a medieval marriage contract, carefully worded, extensively negotiated, and designed to extract maximum value from minimum commitment. The centerpiece was the Spanish marriage, linking his eldest son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. It was an alliance that would bring England into the first tier of European powers, or at least adjacent to it. The negotiations had begun in 1488, when Arthur was 2 and Catherine was 3, because medieval royalty believed in long engagements. By 1501, after 13 years of haggling over dowries, titles, and theoretical virginity, the teenage couple was finally ready to meet. Catherine arrived in England in October 1501, like a medieval package marked fragile and this side up. The storms that delayed her arrival were seen as omens, though whether good or bad depended on who was interpreting. Henry VII, who interpreted everything in monetary terms, was mainly concerned that the dowry arrived intact. The Spanish princess brought 100,000 crowns, Spanish pride, and a retinue that made the English court look provincial. She was 16, accomplished, and had been trained since birth to be Queen of England. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral was Henry's opportunity to show Europe that England had arrived. No expense was spared, which for Henry VII meant that expenses were carefully tracked and wherever possible charged to someone else. London was transformed into a medieval theme park, with pageants, wine fountains, and enough cloth of gold to blind casual observers. Prince Arthur, 15 and scholarly, looked every inch the future king, except for the inches that suggested he might not survive to claim his throne. He was pale, thin, and coughed with disturbing frequency. The wedding night was a matter of state importance, observed with medieval intrusiveness. The young couple was bedded with ceremony, blessed by bishops, and left to produce the Anglo-Spanish heir that would secure both dynasties. Whether the marriage was consummated became one of history's most consequential questions. Arthur later boasted to his gentlemen that he had been in Spain and found it hot work. Catherine would later swear before God and Pope that she emerged from the marriage as virgin as she entered it. The truth died with Arthur, but the question would live, to split the church. 5 months after the wedding, Arthur was dead. The sweating sickness took him at Ludlow Castle, where he'd gone to govern Wales and cough himself to death. Henry VII received the news with the stoicism of a man calculating how much of the dowry he could keep. Catherine became a widow at 16, trapped in England with half a dowry paid and a virginity that was either technical or actual. The obvious solution was to marry her to the new heir, Prince Henry, but that required papal dispensation and more negotiations about money. The younger Henry was everything Arthur wasn't: robust, athletic, and unlikely to die from aggressive breathing. At 11 years old, he was already taller than his brother had been, with the build of someone who would grow into the kind of king who jousted for fun and married for sport. But he was also 11, which even by medieval standards was too young for marriage. Catherine entered limbo, neither wife nor widow, living on an increasingly stingy allowance, while Henry VII negotiated with her parents about who owed whom what. Meanwhile, the Scottish peace was achieved through another marriage, sending Princess Margaret north to marry James IV. The negotiations were simpler because Scotland was poorer and closer, though James drove a hard bargain for a king whose treasury made Henry XI's early finances look robust. Margaret was 13, James was 30, and everyone agreed this was perfectly normal. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace, signed in 1502, was perpetual in the medieval sense, meaning it would last until someone found a reason to break it. Margaret's journey north in 1503 was a procession of English power and Scottish expectation. Henry VII, showing unusual generosity, provided a magnificent trousseau, understanding that his daughter was a permanent ambassador. The wedding at Holyrood Abbey was suitably grand, with James wearing more jewellery than a treasury and Margaret maintaining the dignity expected of a girl marrying a man old enough to be her father. The marriage was surprisingly successful, possibly because James had the good sense to let Margaret grow up before expecting much beyond ceremonial presence. But between these diplomatic triumphs, personal tragedy struck. Elizabeth of York died in February 1503, 11 days after giving birth to a daughter who lived only minutes. She was 37, had borne 7 children, and had spent her entire adult life being Queen of England to a man she'd married for politics. Henry VII's grief was unexpectedly profound for a man who seemed to have replaced most emotions with arithmetic. He retreated to private rooms, refused to conduct business, and showed the kind of humanity that his subjects had forgotten he possessed. The death of Elizabeth marked a turning point in Henry's reign. Without her moderating influence, his avarice grew sharper. Without her Yorkist legitimacy, his paranoia deepened. Without her presence, the court became colder, more focused on extraction than celebration. The king who'd been careful with money became obsessed with it, as if enough gold could fill the space where a queen had been. Hence the Paul Revere, hence the Hausalon, and of late, he never remarried, though not for lack of considering the financial implications of various candidates. Catherine of Aragon's situation deteriorated after Elizabeth's death. Without a queen to protect her, she became a pawn in increasingly sordid negotiations. Henry VII himself considered marrying her, which would have been creative even by medieval standards. Ferdinand and Isabella grew tired of their daughter's letters begging for money and rescue. Prince Henry was formally betrothed to her in 1503. Then the betrothal was privately repudiated in 1505. Then everyone pretended not to know what anyone else actually intended. Catherine learnt to survive on pride and needlework. The Scottish marriage bore fruit in the form of numerous children, most of whom died with the efficiency expected of Tudor-era infants. But James V was born in 1512, ensuring the Stuart line would continue. More importantly for later history, the marriage created the precedent that would eventually unite the English and Scottish crowns. Henry VII had inadvertently solved the Scottish problem through genealogy rather than genocide, which was progress by medieval standards. The final years of Henry's reign were dominated by the question of what to do with Catherine. Keep her for young Henry? Send her back to Spain? Marry her to someone else and keep the dowry? The king, who could make decisions about executing nobles in minutes, spent years dithering about his son's marital future. Perhaps he sensed that this decision would echo through history. Perhaps he just couldn't decide which option was most profitable. By 1509, the marriage alliances had achieved their purposes. England was connected to Spain and Scotland through royal marriages. The kingdom that had been isolated by civil war was now part of European diplomatic networks. The perpetual peace with Scotland would last until it didn't, but it lasted longer than most expected. The Spanish alliance would create complications that nobody foresaw, but that was a problem for the next Henry. The cost had been high. Arthur was dead, Elizabeth was dead, Margaret was in Scotland producing heirs for a foreign throne. Catherine was a living reminder of plans that hadn't survived contact with mortality. But England was at peace, the treasury was full, and Henry VII had proved that marriage negotiations could be as effective as military campaigns, and considerably more profitable. The irony was that Henry, who'd calculated every angle of these marriages, failed to foresee their most important consequence. Young Henry's eventual marriage to Catherine would split the church, revolutionise England, and create more chaos than 30 years of civil war. But that was the future's problem. For now, in 1509, the marriages stood as monuments to Henry VII's diplomatic success, even if those monuments were built on the graves of children and the patience of a Spanish princess who would one day be queen. By 1507, Henry VII had transformed from king into kingdom's chief auditor, spending his days surrounded by account books like a dragon guarding particularly boring treasure. He personally annotated every page with his distinctive spidery handwriting, tracking every penny with the dedication of someone who'd learned that pennies became pounds and pounds became power. The court at Richmond Palace operated more like a counting house than a royal residence, with the king summoning nobles not for feasts, but for financial reconciliations. He supposedly kept a private book listing every subject's debts, fines, and theoretical obligations, updating it nightly like a medieval spreadsheet of paranoia. His health began failing around 1507, though whether from tuberculosis or the strain of constant suspicion was debatable. The king, who'd survived battles, rebellions, and pretenders, was being killed by his own vigilance. He grew thinner, more yellow, more bent over his books, like a miser in a morality play. The coughing fits that interrupted council meetings sounded like death keeping time. But still he counted, still he calculated, still he extracted every possible penny from a kingdom he'd squeezed dry. The isolation of his final years was profound. Elizabeth was dead, Arthur was dead, and the nobles who attended court did so with the enthusiasm of debtors visiting their creditor. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, remained his closest advisor, the two of them ruling England like a particularly stern accounting firm. Prince Henry, now heir, was kept at arm's length, perhaps because the king recognized that his son had expensive tastes and no understanding of compound interest. The court that had once glittered with careful splendor now felt like a well-polluted prison where everyone owed the warden money. Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson reached peak extraction in these final years. They discovered new interpretations of old laws, found fresh violations of ancient statutes, and generally made themselves indispensable to a dying king obsessed with leaving the fullest possible treasury. The nobility lived in terror of their investigations, knowing that somewhere in their family histories was a technical violation that could bankrupt 3 generations. It was government by anxiety, rule through audit, monarchy as protection racket. Front it or flight it. Even dying, Henry couldn't stop calculating. He ordered masses for his soul with the precision of someone negotiating a contract with God. 10,000 masses were purchased, carefully distributed among religious houses according to their efficiency at prayer. He made bequests to churches, but only after ensuring they were tax-deductible. His will was less spiritual document than financial instrument, designed to purchase salvation at the best possible rate. On April 21, 1509, Henry VII died at Richmond Palace, his last breath probably exhaled while calculating the interest on outstanding loans. He left behind a fortune estimated at £1,500,000 sterling 0 pence, more than any English king had accumulated. He also left a kingdom that hadn't seen civil war in 24 years, a dynasty that seemed secure, and a nobility too financially entangled to rebel. His funeral was magnificent because even dead, appearances mattered for credit ratings. Prince Henry became King Henry VIII with the enthusiasm of someone inheriting a lottery win. His first act was to execute Dudley and Empson, throwing his father's financial enforcers to the wolves of noble vengeance. It was the quickest way to distance himself from the previous reign's unpopularity while keeping all its money. The nobility celebrated the dawn of a new era, not yet realizing they'd traded a miser for a spendthrift. The young king also immediately married Catherine of Aragon, solving that diplomatic puzzle with characteristic decisiveness. She'd waited 7 years in limbo, and Henry VIII saw no reason to wait 7 more days. The wedding was hasty, the coronation joint, and suddenly England had a Spanish queen and a king who looked like he could actually joust without dying. It was a new beginning, built on old foundations, youth succeeding age, magnificence replacing miserliness. Henry VII's legacy was as complex as his account books. He'd taken a crown nobody expected him to keep, and held it through paranoia and paperwork. He'd ended the Wars of the Roses, not through military genius, but through making war unprofitable. He'd built a dynasty on the simple principle that debt was stronger than loyalty and fear of bankruptcy more motivating than fear of death. It wasn't heroic, but it was effective. The irony was that everything Henry VII had carefully accumulated, his son would spectacularly spend. The treasury filled over 24 years would empty in less than 10. The careful alliances would shatter over matrimonial theology. The stability purchased with bonds would explode in reformation. Henry VIII would break everything his father had preserved, spend everything his father had saved, and revolutionize the kingdom his father had stabilized. But that was the future's problem. For now, in April 1509, England buried its miser king with appropriate splendour. The funeral effigy showed him as he'd been in youth, thin, calculating, already counting costs. The reality in the coffin was of a man who'd worried himself to death over other people's money. He'd survived pretenders, rebellions, and the general casualty rate of medieval monarchy. In the end, he'd been killed by his own success. The Wars of the Roses were finally, definitively, over. Not because the last battle had been fought, that was Stoke Field in 1487. Not because the last pretender had been executed, that was Warbeck in 1499. But because Henry VII had made them financially impossible. He'd monetized monarchy, turned rebellion into bankruptcy, transformed England from battlefield to account book. It was the least romantic ending possible to 30 years of civil war. Sleep well, Henry Tudor. You were never loved, rarely respected, but always feared, which you understood was more reliable. You gave England peace through paperwork, stability through suspicion, and a dynasty that would last until it didn't. Your son will undo most of what you did, but he'll do it with the money you saved. The irony would probably amuse you, if anything ever did. Sleep well, England. The Wars of the Roses are over, buried under compound interest and recognizances. Tomorrow brings a new Henry, one who thinks money exists to be spent and wives exist to be collected. But tonight, rest in the peace that only complete financial exhaustion can bring. The roses, red and white, have been pressed between the pages of account books. Good night. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.